100 years ending when?
Masturbation was taken out of the lexicon of the American Psychiatric Association in the 1950s. Does that sound right? 53. And that history feeds into the current concept of sex addiction, which was really where I came in because with my first book that Richard mentioned, I saw people that could very easily have been diagnosed as sex addiction by the current kind of approach. And I looked at it and I said, there's something wrong here. Now, first, I as a clinician, I as a scientist, this isn't a concept that is accepted in traditional arguments. It's not scientifically supported. It's not a real legitimate diagnosis. But as I went on places like Dr. Phil and Anderson Cooper and radio shows around the world, everybody wanted to talk to me about sex addiction because the media and pop psychology tell us it's real. I disagreed and ultimately wrote the book because I think it's not just about me being right, which I am. But it's about the fact that I think that sex addiction and the concept of it poses risk to our civil rights, to sexual freedoms, and offers the opportunity for lots of people out there to come into your bedroom and tell you that it's unhealthy for you to have this much sex, and the fact that you've got leather sheets makes it really unhealthy. So, do we want to turn that on?
If you're ready to go, sure.
Okay. You're going to get blinded. Yay. Okay.
Too much masturbation.
You saw that one coming, right? I would say I gave him a straight line, but amongst this audience, I don't think that's right.
We just turned it off because it was because you weren't back yet. But thank you for coming back.
Yeah, holy crap!
I hope you didn't get a meeting nearly as well as you would have done. So.
No, it'll take him a few minutes to catch me.
Oh, okay. So who first applied the term addiction?
So in the early 1980s, a prison psychologist named Patrick Carnes was seeing lots of sexual behaviors amongst men in prison, and he applied the concept of addiction specifically from the Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step model to sexual behavior problems. I think it's really important to know, Carnes argues that he had seen these problems in the 1970s, but he didn't think he'd be taken seriously about them until he brought them forth in the 1980s. I think it's important to think about, though, what was happening then in the 1980s. And let's skip this real quick, and we'll come back to, let me see. Oh, there we go, cool.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see if we can do that. Yeah, there you go. So, what was happening in the 1980s? AIDS. All of a sudden, unrestrained male sexuality could result in death. Now, in the 1970s, our society was in an era when recreational sex was regarded as acceptable. In the 1980s, our society made a big shift, and sex all of a sudden not only could result in death, but a certain kind of sex was labeled very specifically as dangerous. And that form of sex was male sexuality. Now,
women against pornography at the same time.
Yes, because at that same time, our society made a shift. Prior to this, medical textbooks, for instance, had the male form as the norm. The female body was really regarded as kind of an afterthought. Masculinity was held up as the ideal. But, you remember Al Bundy in Married with Children? A bumbling fool led by his penis became the archetype for the American model for masculinity. And, pornography, any form of male sexuality was identified as something that was dangerous to women. And again, this is part of my whole thread that I really invite you to pay attention to, and that is that morality and medicine are two different things, but in the concept of sex addiction, these two things are being put together and used to constrain our behaviors and identify our behaviors and desires as something potentially unhealthy. Carnes came out with the concept of sex addiction in the midst of this, and all of a sudden, the idea that men and male sexual desires, and unrestrained sexual desires in general, could be a disease was accepted at large. Now, for 100 years or more, women who liked sex too much were called nymphomaniacs, and horrible things were done to them. They had lobotomies, they had their clitorises removed, they were institutionalized, awful, awful stuff. Now it's men's turn, apparently, as male sexuality and any men who pursue unrestrained male sexual expression, particularly LGBT men, as we'll talk about, are at tremendous risk of being called disordered. Now, as we talk, I wanted you guys to see these questions, okay?
So this is how sex addicts are diagnosed by this concept.
Yeah.
Right?
Let me see if I can get over here. So, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but this is from a test called the Sex Addiction Screening Test by Carnes. Do you feel your sexual behavior is normal? It's kind of a loaded question, isn't it? Because what is normal? Normal in San Francisco, I think, is very different from normal in Iowa. Any of your sexual activities against the law? Well, which law? In which state? I know nudity is up for debate here. Is it against the law or not? One day you're an addict and one day you're not. Do you hide some of your sexual behaviors from others? Everybody I know, and I obviously know kinky, sexy people, kept their masturbation secret as a kid. Does that make them unhealthy? And does that make masturbation unhealthy? I don't think so, but these folks do. If you have ever looked at a dirty picture, God help me, if you have ever spent money to look at a dirty picture, you might be a sex addict. Have sex with more than one person at a time? Yay! I think we can just treat question 46 as a given. Do we have a big check mark we can just put right there? Bathhouses, cruising. It sounds like this might lean towards diagnosing the gay population, but I could be wrong. Now, one thing about those questions, okay? If you get 6 right, I only have 6 fingers. There you go. If you get 6 right, you're a sex addict.
Out of the 51?
Yeah.
Not per screen.
No.
You're lying if you don't give 6 of us.
Now here's an interesting thing, okay? Some of the only research done on that certain test, there's been research on others of these tests that show that all they do is diagnose libido. If you like sex, you must be a sex addict. But this test in particular I think is interesting because it overdiagnoses a certain group, a certain population. Who?
Amen.
The clergy. Not because they like touching young boys, but because the clergy are folks who are trying to restrain and constrain sexual feelings. And so any sexual feelings that they're struggling with, they experience as a strong internal conflict. Some of the research that I really love about this stuff is done by a guy named Jason Winters in Canada. And he found that the folks who are most likely to self-diagnose as sex addicts are people who have a high libido, they really like sex, and they grew up in a religious or a strictly moral background to where they internally self-identify that sexual desire as unhealthy. So what we're diagnosing here is that internal conflict, not a disease. So, and now we're back and we're on.
So, it sounds like the same thing as the ex-gay therapies. I mean, the problem isn't for them being gay, the problem is hating themselves for being gay, right?
Yeah, the problem is hating themselves for being gay, and why do they hate themselves for being gay? Because society tells them to.
Well, and the same thing with people with high libido or in these situations where they have fundamentalist beliefs but strong sexual activity. Well, so, okay, then sex addiction, does the treatment take the same form as like, when treatment is prescribed, what is it? Is it total abstinence like in other 12-step programs, or does it bear any resemblance to 12-step programs for addiction?
Two questions, okay? One is, what does treatment for sex addiction look like? It is 12-step treatment, and you're paying a lot of money for it. Now, I want to be clear again. I'm not an opponent to 12-step treatment. I think 12-step treatment offers a lot of support and a lot of help to a lot of people. My agency, I actually run a large behavioral health agency in New Mexico, and we treat about 2,000 people a year. Sex issues make up like 5 or 10 people a year, because I'm the only person that treats them. We do lots and lots of substance abuse treatment, and we have 12-step groups in my agency that we offer space to. I think it's a very valuable support. It's not medicine, though. It's not diagnosis. If you go to sex addiction treatment, you will pay about $1,000 to $1,200 a day, $1,000 to $1,200 a day for sex addiction treatment. That is based on 12-step models.
The 12-step models are free.
12-step models are free. And there's no research that shows that it's appropriate to apply them in a residential setting. Now, one of the facilities I toured in Arizona, where David Duchovny has famously gotten treatment, David Duchovny threatened to sue me because every time they run an article about my book, they show a picture of David Duchovny, his famous celebrity. So his attorney sent me a letter and said, stop using Duchovny's name. And I said, I'm not. It's the newspapers. Well, the newspapers got wind of that and ran a big article that went viral worldwide. Thousands of websites picked up the story that David Duchovny, who I used to have a real crush on, it's kind of sad, was out to get me. So, but if you tour this facility in Arizona, where you can get $1,000 a day sex addiction treatment, there's no evidence that this stuff works. And there's these giant saguaro cactus all around. Now, anybody having experience with giant saguaro cactus? They look just like dildos and butt plugs. And they're everywhere. I couldn't get sex out of my mind. But they're covered in giant thorns. So maybe, if you get too excited, it's a behavioral conditioning technique to take away that arousal. And I think that's one of the dilemmas, is that the treatments for sex addiction are largely driven by moral groups, religious groups, and very subjective determinations of what's healthy sex. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to come into your bedroom and tell you what kind of sex is healthy or not. These folks are doing that, though. And they are specifically coming into your home and telling you, if you have an orgasm more than once a day, you're a sex addict. Now, if you're multiply orgasmic and you have a good night, you just threw your whole average. they are making very specific determinations about what kinds of sexual behaviors are healthy, and they're doing that based upon the problems that they see walk in the door. Unfortunately, they're making that determination based upon the problems that walk in the door, and they're not looking at all the folks out there that are engaging in that same behavior and not having those problems.
Those aren't driven by the court?
No, the court's a whole other issue. This is strictly, again, it's pop psychology, because this isn't stuff that is accepted by science or medicine because it hasn't been peer reviewed. It doesn't go through an extensive scientific review process to identify the validity of these concepts. The courts, unfortunately, have, just like you and I, and
they watch Oprah too.
Yeah, they watch Oprah too, and they've accepted the media barrage of Dr. Drew and others that are saying that sex addiction is real. The courts are now ordering people into sex addiction treatment, and in August of this year, a guy named Jason Williford in North Carolina raped and killed a woman named Kathy. His defense in court was not, I didn't know it. His defense in court was, I'm a sex addict and it's really not my fault. And the defense was not trying to get him off. The defense was trying to prevent him from... That one was unintentional. But he got it, which says something about him.
We got it too, we were just being polite.
What were they trying to do?
They were trying to avoid the death penalty. And they did, and he got life in prison. So that's the other sad thing. Is one of the things that, again, I think is important here is that morality and medicine are now being combined, and the courts are taking it legitimately. And at the end, one of the things I'll show you is why you should be concerned because of the history that we have with that kind of approach.
If the incidence of your sexual encounters, or even the number of orgasms you have in a week, is one of the factors, although in those 51 questions it didn't look like that was all they were concerned about. But if it is one, is there any research about what is normal?
And that's unfortunately part of the big problem.
That's just completely different from culture to culture.
Yeah, normal is varying from culture to culture. The Polynesian cultures traditionally are very sex positive, very accepting of sex, very accepting of infidelity or non-monogamy. Our culture, not so much. And one of the big issues that I argue is that this is a culturally biased phenomenon. This is a definition by Patrick Carnes. Now, one of the things to know is that the sex addiction field took off. Carnes put it out there, and other people loved it because they were scared of sex too. And there are lots and lots of definitions out there. And an entire chapter of my book is dedicated to the many varied definitions for sex. One of the definitions for sex addiction is, quote, when we can't bear to be with ourselves. Now, that's me before I have coffee in the morning. It is certainly everybody in my household before I have coffee in the morning. They can't bear to be with me either. The definitions are very broad and very subjective, but this is one of Carnes' strongest. Safe, secret, abusive, feelings, or empty. Well, empty is kind of a subjective word, I'm going to say. Why is your relationship empty and somebody else's is not? Secret, if I get on a plane and I go to Africa, I'm going to have to constrain or keep secret my attraction to men because in some countries in Africa, I may experience significant legal, even life-threatening consequences as a result of my desire for other men. Is that because of an illness or is that because of a social consequence? I think it's the latter. Abusive, and I'm going to show you a quote in a little bit about what Carnes in the field of sex addiction think about S&M. But the last one I do like to point out is if you've ever used sex to avoid painful feelings, stress, anxiety, or sadness. It is a myth that 9 months after a catastrophe or tragedy, lots of babies are born. It doesn't appear to be true. But there's something to that idea, right? That after sad or bad things happen, it helps us to be connected to somebody else, to make love. That's not an unhealthy thing. But these folks think it is.
David, can I ask another question?
Please.
As long as we're talking. First of all, what PhD is this? Animal husbandry or, what's his degree?
Carnes actually was a psychologist.
Okay.
However, being a psychologist, let me tell you, that's no defense. I may never hire another psychologist to get into my life.
But going back in American history, what did Kinsey have to say? Kinsey
said, the definition of a nymphomaniac or a sex addict is anybody who has more sex than a therapist. I don't think anything has changed.
Is Kinsey peer reviewed?
But David, before we get into questions, I really would like David to finish his presentation
Sure.
here, because the answer will forestall a lot of things that he would otherwise ask. Like, do we have any idea how many women are diagnosed with sexual addiction?
So the research on sex addiction is really bad. I call it junk science, and that's being generous. It is anecdotal. It's based on simply the folks that walk in the door. It is overwhelmingly trying to achieve a certain kind of result. A couple of things that we do know, though. 85 to 95% of alleged sex addicts are men.
85?
85 to 95% are men. Now, the women who get diagnosed as sex addicts are women who are bisexual and have a high libido.
Or sluts.
Yeah, that goes without saying, right? It's in there. If you get called a sex addict, then you're a slut and you're a woman. The men, though, kind of break into a couple of groups. One is a man who is in a relationship where he wants more sex than his partner. It doesn't matter if he wants sex once a month and she wants sex once a year. He's a sex addict. Number two is those folks that I identified that have an internal conflict about their level of desire and their fear of that desire. All right? The third group is the folks that we're familiar with that are famous and get in trouble for sex. Now,
David Duchovny?
Yeah, David Duchovny. Larry Craig, Tiger Woods, and I think there's something very convoluted going on here, okay? And that is that for thousands of years, men have engaged in sexual privilege. So a man with power was able to have sex, as much sex as he wanted and could afford. That's not allowed anymore these days. David and Solomon had thousands of wives in the Bible, and that wasn't enough for David. He had to kill that other guy and take Bathsheba. But in today's world, a man who gets caught having sex that he's not supposed to have gets called a sex addict, goes to 12-step treatment or residential treatment, comes back and everything's okay. Eliot Spitzer was governor of New York, got in trouble for prostitutes, right? During the scandal, his advisors went to him and said, Eliot, we want you to come out and say you're a sex addict, go to treatment, and it will make these problems go away. Spitzer, whether you like the guy or not, said, no, I've always held the people that work for me to be responsible for their behaviors. I can do no less. So sex addiction is being used in several different ways. One way is to stigmatize sex and stigmatize male sex. The other is to offer this strange devil made me do it excuse that then lets you off the hook. This is one of the dangers, though, I think, that is really significant, which is the danger to the LGBT population. It's one of the reasons why I'm really excited to be talking with you guys, because I think we need to take it seriously. I think we need to... It's real easy to say, this doesn't really matter, this is a pop psychology concept, it doesn't really matter. Now, one of the things I questioned as I went into this book was I just being a prick by trying to undercut this, by trying to say, yeah, I'm smarter than you guys, this isn't real? I went into the book wondering, was I missing something? I came out of the book saying, I think this is dangerous. This is a great example of why I think it's dangerous. So this is a book called Addicted to Love by a woman named Charlotte Castle. And she says, some gay men have long-term committed relationships, but it's not uncommon for some of them to have many, many partners in a bathhouse where sex is soulless and emotionless. This is her definition of sex addiction. And there's more. Larry Craig, Ted Haggard, Mark Foley. These are three very famous, publicly outed men engaging in sex with men. All of them called sex addicts. Because they were engaging in sex with men, the problem that they experienced as a result of the social response to them being married, public, conservative figures caught having sex with men. It's not about their desire for sex. This is a social problem. This is a social conflict. If we lived in a society where it was okay for men to have sex with other men, even if they were married and conservative, this wouldn't be a problem. LGBT folks are at very high risk of being called sex addicts. LGBT folks tend to have higher numbers of sex partners. LGBT folks have higher rates of non-monogamous relationships. Some research suggests that amongst committed male homosexual relationships, 70% of them are non-monogamous in one fashion or another. Men and gay males more frequently have casual sex or anonymous sex, are more frequently involved in kink.
But it's not soulless.
It's not soulless. And you can't tell really, but this is one of those lovely mosaic pictures of Rick Santorum that's made up of thousands of gay porn pictures. This tooth right there is a really hot scene.
The details.
You keep on using LGBT and then equating it to gay male, and I'm confused by that.
Gay and bi males are particularly at high risk because the various behaviors and symptoms that go into a diagnosis of sex addiction are typically male behaviors. They are not behaviors that women don't engage in by any means, but they are behaviors like masturbation, use of pornography, infidelity, going to prostitutes, going to strip clubs. These are things that males engage in more of.
So the LGBT, you actually mean the G?
I'm really talking about the GB. However, one of the things that I think is significant is for many folks who go through a period of questioning of their sexuality, they experience periods where they try and constrain those sexual desires and they try and act in a different way. It's awfully close to anybody who is trying to constrain or control sexual desires. Internet porn. LGBT folks, and I include lesbians and everybody else in this, can consume internet pornography at much higher rates than their straight counterparts. Because we're all addicted to porn? No. Because internet porn is oftentimes one of the only early places where we can encounter appropriate, same orientation stimuli. And I can't tell you how many gay folks I've talked to who say, I really first learned about what gay sex was like from porn. Heterosexual folks don't say that. And the use of pornography, and Rick Santorum specifically, wants to protect you from porn. Because they want to save us gays. This is Jeremy Friedbaum, Utah Senate candidate, right fucking now. This is not in the 1960s. This is now. That he is publicly saying and being accepted as legitimate, saying that homosexuality is the result of addiction and a disorder.
Does he realize he's saying that the more you like sex, the more likely you are to be gay?
Yeah, exactly. And here, let me skip this one and go back to it, okay? I'm going to go back to the BDSM. What'd you say?
He's allowed to have multiple wives. So.
Oh, in Utah, yeah.
Privately.
These folks, again, look at the intrusion of morality and religious beliefs, all right? Life Ministries is battling sex addiction. Planned Parenthood is passing the gateway drug of masturbation. The XXX Church, which is a ministry in Las Vegas that focuses specifically on foreign workers, believes exclusively that homosexuality results from the tolerance effect. Tolerance is an addiction concept that is really inappropriately applied in sex addiction concepts. But tolerance is where, when I first started drinking, a beer or two would get me pretty wasted, and now it takes, 6 or 12, right? That's tolerance. They argue that same process is causing homosexuality. And they don't need conclusive scientific or medical research to restrict your behavior. That is their belief in their arguments. Remember the early quote from Reagan. It's awfully close to this, isn't it?
David, if there's a treatment provider certification, are there statistics of success? Is there research done on what the success is of these sexual addiction treatment providers?
None whatsoever. There are, at last count, there are about 12 studies that have been published in 30 years of the sex addiction concept. 30 years, and they published about 12 studies saying whether or not this works. Now, a couple of those studies are art therapy studies. The rest of them are studies about certain kinds of medications that can be prescribed to treat hypersexual behavior or sex addiction. What are those medications? Well, anybody in here take an SSRI? Wellbutrin, Prozac, Zoloft. Those medications often cause impotence and impede sexual behaviors. They reduce libido, particularly in men. They want to rebadge those medicines. They want to sell them because they're prohibited by the FDA from marketing any meds off-label. What that means is, I can't come to you and say this medication is an appropriate treatment for this disorder unless that's a real disorder and there's real research to back it up. Sex addiction is not real, it's not accepted, it's not legitimately supported, so they can't market it that way. But if it becomes a real disorder, if it was accepted and legitimized, then they could sell them to you. These are the same companies that are selling Prozac and Zoloft that will inhibit sexual desires. It's a side effect, and the same companies that are selling Viagra and Cialis. They're going to get you coming and going.
So to speak.
So how close is that to becoming a reality? I mean, I know, thanks to Richard, that the DSM does not include a sex addiction diagnosis. But the next one might include something like an appendix, you said, of something called hypersexual disorder?
So I actually call this the hokey pokey. And this is not the part where we all stand up and do a dance. But the hokey pokey, you put your left leg in, you put your left leg out, right? The DSM has done the hokey pokey over the past 60 or 70 years with sex addiction. It was in under the label nymphomania, and then it was out. And then it was in, and then it was out. And then it was in, and then it was out. under various concepts and terms, under various labels. There is currently one last little vestige of this concept in the current DSM. Now, the DSM is called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. It's a compendium of various mental disorders. Depression is defined in there, and post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, things like that. In there is a concept called sexual disorder not otherwise specified. It's a catch bag. And there's one little thing that says, for people who view sex with others as conquests. This is an old concept from way back in the day, Don Juan. Remember the movie Don Juan DeMarco with Johnny Depp? Really beautiful guy, great movie. Don Juan was a character in an 1800s poem by Lord Byron who just pursued women, kind of like Casanova. Back in the day, when nymphomania was a diagnosis, Don Juanism was another diagnosis. That label is still in there, a little tiny bit. It's been all over the net just in the past 2 weeks that there is now research about this hypersexual disorder concept. And everybody is saying, and Dr. Drew is one, who is saying, oh, look, see, it's real. Hypersexual disorder is a proposed concept that will go in the DSM for future research. In the appendix, you can't diagnose it. It's just for future research or for future considerations. So we can learn more about it, which really we need to do. We need to learn more about it to find out if there's anything true in there. But here's a couple of really interesting things about the hypersexual disorder concept. One is that it doesn't include any of the addiction language. Addiction language of being powerless, addiction language over tolerance or withdrawal. What it does include is certain behaviors, including cyber sex and telephone sex. I argue if I use Skype to call up a 1-900 line and I jerk off talking to an operator, am I a cyber sex addict or a phone sex addict? Or both. I've got it double-barreled, right? So they're doing some research, though, on this concept, and it's finding some interesting things. This diagnosis, right now, if it went into effect today, over-pathologizes, over-diagnoses white men who make over $80,000 or $85,000 a year. So remember that privilege concept I talked about before? Here, we're giving privileged men who get in trouble for their sexual behaviors an out. If we applied that same ratio and we had a diagnosis that was over-pathologizing black men who were poor, I think we would have a social problem with that. I think we would view this as evidence of social bias and stigma. Why doesn't it work that way? Here's the other thing. So in this study that was just published like 3 weeks ago by a guy named Rory Reid, R-E-I-D, he's a UCLA researcher and actually a good, compassionate, careful guy. Again, this is some of the only real research that's ever been done on this. Twice as many folks in this sex addiction group, hypersexual disorder group, are LGBT versus folks who are mentally disordered or have substance or alcohol addictions. Twice as many are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Why are we doing this? That's what's coming down the pike.
So, my last question, and I asked you this at home, and I really liked your answer, so I want everybody to hear it. I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room who's ever had anxiety about my sexual behavior, my sexual drives. I can remember my 20s in New Orleans, where the bars never closed, thinking, I can't leave. I can't go home until I find somebody to touch me, or somebody that I can be with tonight. And I was so driven that I scared myself a little bit sometimes. Mm-hmm. And, now we are at a time in our lives, well past the 80s, but not past the crisis, of really bad things happening to people who do this sexual acting out, and then knowing people whose sexual behavior is very destructive.
Right.
What do we say to them?
I say a couple of things. And first, one important thing is that the desire for connection and the desire to not be alone and the desire to have a physical contact with somebody is not an unhealthy thing. I was born with one hand. I have a very obvious but not very disabling physical condition. I can't hide it, but it really doesn't get in my way. But all of my life, having sex with someone and having somebody touch me physically and sexually was an incredible experience of acceptance and love, of people saying to me, your body might be different, but it's not unhealthy, it's not unattractive. That meant a tremendous amount to me. And there are times that I have pursued that sexual contact as a result of that. That level of desire and need for connection has much more to do with loneliness and social rejection and the struggles of connecting in this cold world, much more than it does to say this is a sexual issue. It's not. It's about being lonely, and it's about being sad, and it's about being scared. Those are hard things that we need connection with other people to deal with. Secondly, I'm going to say, overwhelmingly, again, the little research that has been done about folks that are diagnosed as sex addicts shows that they have other problems. 70 to 100% of the folks identified as sex addicts have other major mental health conditions or personality disorders that lead them to engage in very unhealthy behaviors of many different kinds. Sex is just one of them. Tiger Woods, a recent biography of him was put out by one of his coaches, and the coach said, Tiger was engaging in very selfish, unhealthy behaviors toward lots of people. Sex was just one of them. Unfortunately, our society is so obsessed and so frightened by sex that we are over-diagnosing, and we're looking at these sexual behaviors and saying that's the problem. But guess what? There's a whole iceberg beneath it that we're ignoring because we're over-focused on the sex. I think for those folks who are, at the bars struggling and having sex with people engaging in sexual behaviors that they identify are risky, I think we should be asking a lot more questions about their relationships and their society and the environment in which they're living and the messages they're getting about sex. The problem is not the sex behavior. The problem is the context within which those things are occurring.
Jorge works with Stop AIDS here in San Francisco and has also a long history in the kink community. So let's let you wrap us up before it's about time to take the break, is it?
Yeah, I just have a question as far as where do you view the CDC being a moral force?
The CDC, Center for Disease Control?
Correct. I mean, right now they're saying that if you have more than 6 sex partners in a certain amount of time, you're considered high risk. So now we're not only fighting against moral forces, but we're actually fighting against epidemiology, which is technically a science. So how do you see that feeding into structural intervention, closing of bathhouses, that sort of
Sure. I think it comes in, one, with regards to this, that we're heading towards a place where we are potentially diagnosing anybody who makes a bad choice, like being sick, smoking.
Yeah.
Having 6 partners in the past year may put you at risk for something, but it doesn't mean you're sick. And this is not new. Now, again, I like that you bring up CDC and the research. So in the 1980s, y'all remember hearing about crack babies. Crack babies were going to ruin society. Crack babies were going to shut down Medicaid because of our inability to care for these severely disabled, overwhelming children of this abominable drug. And laws were passed that made use of crack punishable much more severely than use of cocaine. Why? because crack was 10 times more addictive than regular cocaine. Was it true? No. Turns out it wasn't. And in fact, right now, laws are being withdrawn and rescinded because of that. Because bad data, or data that was used by moral forces, was used to convince society to move in a certain direction. In 1919, alcohol use was prohibited by a very small, committed minority who said that use of alcohol was immoral. The many folks who used alcohol couldn't stand up and admit it because they were immediately criticized as being immoral. What's happening nowadays? Porn causes impotence. Porn addiction makes men's penises stop working the way they're supposed to. And so, there are, and I'm not even making this up. I mean, it sounds like I am. It sounds like a comic book. But there are significant folks arguing that porn addiction is a disease that you need to be protected from. Judith Reisman is a communications professor who's testified before Congress multiple times. She argues that the use of pornography releases what she calls erototoxins, toxic chemicals in your brain that rot your brain, and as a result, you need to be protected from it. Okay? Hang on just a sec. The thing is, okay, this is just a moral panic, but it's a moral panic that has the ability to influence law and society. But remember, this shit will just make you go blind. It's nothing new from what it was in the past when certain committed folks decided that the kind of sex you had or the kind of sex you want to have was unhealthy. One of the research studies that I really like to cite was done in the mid-1980s, and they found that one of the only distinctions between alleged sex addicts and non-sex addicts was that the alleged sex addicts were having sex about as much as the non-sex addicts wanted to have. These are folks who have decided that for some reason certain kinds of sex that they're not comfortable with are immoral and potentially diseased, and you should be protected from them. Or if you want that you should be treated. I don't think that's medicine, and I don't think that's science. If moral groups want to get out there and argue against this, that's fine. I can't stop them. I can stop them from using science and medicine, which I believe in a way to restrict other people's civil rights, which I don't.
Thank you.
Do we want to take a break? And then I'm still here. I'm not going away.
He's all yours when we come back. Our volunteers, Guy and Chad, and our other wonderful volunteers have some refreshments for you in the back there. We'll be back in 10 minutes.